The healer's ward door was barred from the outside, and I could hear a child coughing on the other side of it, wet and ragged in a way that meant we had perhaps an hour left. If that. "Open it," I said to the guard standing in front of it, my voice steadier than I felt. "Lady Rowena has no authority to lock a healer out of a ward full of dying children. She has given clear instruction," he said, not meeting my eyes. "No one enters until the king himself countermands it." Somewhere behind me, I heard boots moving at a run, and Leif's voice, sharper than I had ever heard it, demanding to know exactly which of his court had decided a locked door was worth more than a child's life. I did not know yet whether we would reach that ward in time. I only knew I had spent 3 weeks being laughed at for carrying a satchel of dried herbs everywhere I went, and I was not about to let that laughter be the last word. Let me tell you how I ended up outside that door. Because it started 3 weeks earlier, at the summer gathering, when a king's wolf walked past every polished daughter in that hall and lay down at the feet of the woman everyone called the hedge-witch's daughter. I was 24, and I had spent most of my life at the edge of the territory, in the small cottage my mother had raised me in, learning the particular craft the villagers both relied on and quietly feared, which roots broke a fever, which leaves stopped bleeding, which barks, boiled properly, could pull a poison back out of the blood before it finished its work. My mother had died 2 winters past, and I had continued her work largely alone since, treating whoever walked far enough to find our cottage and asking little in return beyond what they could spare. The village had always kept a careful, respectful distance from our cottage, close enough to send for me when a fever ran high or a birth went wrong, far enough that no one ever quite invited me to sit at their table afterward. I had grown used to that particular shape of belonging, needed, occasionally, valued in the moment a remedy was required, and otherwise mostly forgotten. I did not resent it, exactly. I had simply stopped expecting anything else from the world by the time I was old enough to understand the pattern. I had not wanted to attend the summer gathering at all. I went because the village elder insisted every household send a representative, and because refusing would have drawn considerably more attention than simply standing quietly at the back of a crowded hall for one evening. I wore my mother's old traveling dress, mended twice at the hem, and carried her satchel out of pure habit rather than any expectation I would need it. The way I carried it everywhere, because a healer who leaves her remedies at home is not much use to anyone who needs her unexpectedly. I did not expect King Leif's wolf to cross that entire hall and stop in front of me. The room went silent first, the particular silence that precedes either violence or a joke everyone is waiting to be let in on. And then, once his wolf lowered itself to the floor at my feet, the silence broke into something considerably worse. Laughter, not from everyone at once, but starting somewhere near the front of the hall and spreading outward, the way laughter does when it finds permission, until half the assembled nobility of Leif's court was openly, unashamedly laughing at the sight of their king's wolf choosing the hedge-witch's daughter, satchel of dried roots still slung across her shoulder, over every carefully dressed woman in the room. I did not join the laughter. I stood very still, my face doing whatever it needed to do to keep from showing how much that particular sound cost me, and watched King Leif's face go through something I did not have a name for yet, not embarrassment, though I expected that, but something considerably closer to fury, aimed entirely at the room rather than at me. "Enough," he said, and the hall's laughter did not stop immediately, because 3 weeks of habit does not break on a single word. But it did, gradually, wither into something quieter and considerably more careful. I was escorted, that same evening, into rooms I had never expected to occupy, considerably finer than anything my cottage had ever offered, while the court's whispers followed me down every corridor. A serving girl helped me out of my mended traveling dress with careful, uncertain hands, as though unsure whether I was meant to be treated as a guest or an oddity, and I did not have the heart to tell her I was not entirely certain myself. I did not sleep well that first night. I lay awake turning the strangeness of my own circumstance over in my mind, certain that whatever had happened in that hall was some mistake a king's own composure would correct by morning. It was not corrected by morning. Leaf came to see me himself the following day, and I understood, watching him enter that small chamber with none of the practiced formality I had seen him wear the night before, exactly how deliberately he had chosen to stand by whatever his wolf had decided. "I owe you an apology for that hall," he said, without preamble. I did not expect the laughter, and I should have silenced it faster than I did. "You need not apologize on my behalf," I said. "I have been laughed at before. It costs me considerably less than you seem to think it does." "It should cost you nothing at all," he said, something hardening in his voice. "My wolf has never once been wrong about anything that mattered. I do not intend to let a hall full of people who have never had to survive a single winter on their own knowledge decide that its judgment was somehow a mistake." I did not know what to do with the plain conviction in that statement, so I said the only honest thing I had left. "Your court does not agree with your wolf's judgment, Your Grace. I would ask you to consider what it costs you. Standing by a woman half your nobility finds an embarrassment." "I have considered it," he said. "I find I am considerably less interested in their comfort than I am in doing right by whatever my own instincts have decided. And I would ask you not to spend your energy managing my reputation on my behalf. I am entirely capable of managing it myself." "That is a great deal of confidence," I said, "for a man who has known me exactly one evening longer than the rest of his court has." "My wolf has known you considerably longer than one evening," he said. "It simply took the rest of me slightly longer to catch up to what it already understood. I am not accustomed to being wrong about people once my instincts have settled on them, and I do not intend to start doubting that instinct now, simply because a hall full of strangers found it inconvenient to witness." I did not have an answer ready for that kind of certainty, so I said nothing, and let it sit between us the way I would learn, over the following days, most true things between us like to sit. The weeks that followed did not grow easier quickly. Lady Rowena, I learned within days, had been the court's presumed favorite before that gathering. Beautiful, well-connected, groomed since childhood for exactly the position Leif's wolf had instead handed to a woman carrying dried roots in a cracked leather satchel. She did not scream or rage about it, which would have been easier, in some ways, to simply weather. She was considerably more patient than that. She organized the mockery the way a general organizes a campaign, quiet corrections about my table manners delivered just loudly enough for others to hear. Careful jokes about hedge-witches and superstition dropped into conversations she made certain I was standing close enough to catch. "You should not carry that satchel through the halls," she told me once, with the particular pleasant cruelty of a woman who has practiced this exact tone for years. "It makes you look like a peddler rather than anyone's intended." "I would rather look like a peddler with useful knowledge," I said, "than look elegant with none at all." Something in her smile went very brittle at that, though she said nothing further, and I understood, watching her walk away, that I had just made an enemy considerably more dangerous than open laughter could ever be. The rest of the court took its cue from her, the way courts always do, dressing their mockery in the particular polite cruelty nobility specializes in, comments about my accent, my mended hems, my complete inability to navigate the choreography of a formal dance I had never once been taught. I bore most of it in silence, telling myself it cost me nothing, though I noticed, some nights, that the silence took considerably more effort to maintain than I let anyone see. I found some steadiness, in those weeks, in Leif's own company, which surprised me more than I let on. He sought me out most evenings, in a small library that had quickly become the place I retreated to when the court's careful cruelty grew too loud. And I found, over those quiet hours, that the man beneath the crown was considerably drier and more thoughtful than the composed king his court believed they knew. "Why does it not shake you?" he asked once, watching me sort dried herbs by lamplight rather than attend some formal supper I had quietly excused myself from. The mockery. I have watched hardened warriors flinch under considerably less, because I have buried a mother, treated fevers with my own 2 hands, and walked 3 hours through snow more than once to reach someone who needed help faster than the cold would allow, I said. A room full of people laughing at my satchel does not frighten me nearly as much as it seems to frighten them, that I am not frightened by it. Something in his face shifted at that, warm and startled, and I understood, in that small, unremarkable moment, exactly why his wolf might have recognized something in me that a glittering hall full of polished daughters had never offered him at all. "I am beginning to think," he said, quiet, "that the very thing my court finds embarrassing about you is the exact thing I find myself unable to stop admiring." "That is a dangerous thing for a king to admit to a hedge-witch's daughter," I said, though I felt something warm move through me at hearing it regardless. "I have never been particularly interested in what is safe," he said, "when it comes to deciding who deserves my attention. I am considerably more interested in what is true. If you want to find out whether the court's laughter ever actually stopped, and what happened the day I finally proved exactly what 3 weeks of mockery had underestimated, stay with me through to the end of this. Follow along so you do not lose the thread of what happens when a king refuses to be embarrassed out of the one judgment he trusts most." It was 3 weeks after that first gathering, on an ordinary afternoon that quickly stopped being ordinary, that the first child fell ill. The healer's ward filled within 2 days, a fever that broke and returned in waves, a rash spreading in patterns none of the court's trained physicians recognized, and by the 3rd day, 6 children lay in that ward, including, I learned with a particular cold dread, Lady Rowena's own young niece, sent to court that season to be fostered under her aunt's supervision. The castle's mood shifted overnight, the careful cruelty of the previous weeks giving way to a different kind of tension entirely. Parents pacing corridors outside the ward, physicians conferring in increasingly worried tones. The ordinary business of court grinding nearly to a halt under the particular dread that settles over any household with sick children in it. I found myself, for the first time since the summer gathering, entirely forgotten by the gossip that had followed me for weeks, which would have been a relief under any other circumstance. I recognized the pattern the moment Hadrian described it to me, secondhand, over supper. A fever pattern my mother had once described to me from her own girlhood, an outbreak she had seen exactly once, in a village 2 valleys over, cured with a preparation of silver-leaf root that most modern healers considered folk superstition rather than genuine medicine. I remembered the exact cadence of her voice describing it, years before I ever imagined needing the memory myself, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ward's fever at all. I brought my suspicion to the court physician myself, and was informed, politely but firmly, that a hedge-witch's guesswork was not a substitute for trained medicine, and that my satchel of dried roots would not be needed in his ward. I did not argue that first refusal as loudly as I should have. I want to be honest about that, because it nearly cost considerably more than my pride. I told myself the physician knew his craft better than I did, that a trained man's dismissal carried more weight than my own uncertain memory of a fever my mother had described to me only once, years ago. By a fire, I could still picture more clearly than I could picture the actual words she had used. I waited 2 more days, watching the ward's numbers climb, before I finally understood that waiting politely was going to get someone's child killed. I went to Leif directly on the 5th day, The physician is treating the wrong illness, I said. I have seen this pattern described before. If I am right, silverleaf root will break the fever within a day. If I am wrong, it will do nothing at all, and we will have lost nothing but a little time we do not currently have to spare regardless. He did not hesitate the way the physician had. Then go, he said. I will make certain no one bars your way. He should have been able to make certain of that. He was not, in the end, quite fast enough. Rowena moved that same evening. Once she understood I intended to treat the ward myself. She went before the court physician and the household steward together, claiming, with practiced alarm, that a hedge-witch's unproven remedy risked poisoning already weakened children, that my presence near the ward at all was reckless beyond excuse. And beneath that argument, though she never said it plainly, I understood she was terrified of what it would mean. For her own standing, if the woman she had spent 3 weeks mocking turned out to be the one who saved her niece's life. The steward, cautious and uncertain, ordered the ward sealed until the king could personally review the matter the following morning. I did not have until morning. Neither, I suspected, did at least one of the children inside. I learned of the order second-hand, from a kitchen maid who had overheard the steward's instructions and run to find me rather than let the news arrive too late to matter. I went to the ward directly, my satchel already in hand, certain I could simply explain the urgency to whichever guard stood post and be let through. I had not accounted for how thoroughly Rowena's alarm had already spread, nor for how frightened an ordinary guard becomes when a household steward's direct order sits between him and a decision that is not his to make. That is the scene I told you about at the very beginning of this, the barred door, the child's ragged coughing on the other side of it, my own voice telling a guard that no one had the authority to let a door outweigh a life. That is the scene I told you about at the very beginning of this, the barred door, the child's ragged coughing on the other side of it, my own voice telling a guard that no one had the authority to let a door outweigh a life. Leaf reached us at a run, Hadrian a step behind him, and I watched something in his composure finally, completely break in front of the gathered household staff. Who gave the order to bar this door? He said, his voice gone very quiet and very dangerous. Lady Rowena, Your Grace, the guard said, citing concern for the children's safety. The only thing endangering these children right now, Leif said, is a locked door standing between them and the one person in this castle who has correctly identified what is actually killing them. Open it. The door came open. I was inside that ward within the minute, my satchel already open, preparing the silver-leaf preparation my mother had once described to me by firelight. Years before I ever imagined needing it myself, my hands did not shake, though every other part of me felt the full weight of what I was gambling on a memory nearly a decade old. I measured the root with the same care my mother had once shown me, steeped it exactly as long as she had always insisted, and worked my way down the row of small, fevered faces one at a time, praying my memory had not failed me somewhere along the way. The waiting afterward was its own particular kind of agony. I sat beside the youngest child's cot through most of that night, watching for any sign the fever's pattern had actually shifted, while Leaf stayed the entire time as well, saying little, simply present in the doorway. The way I had come to understand was the truest comfort he knew how to offer. The fever broke in the first child within 6 hours. By morning, 4 of the 6 were sitting up, weak but clearly recovering, and by the following evening, even Rowena's own niece, the sickest of the group, the one whose danger had driven Rowena's desperate lockdown in the first place, had opened her eyes and asked, in a small clear voice, for water. I did not gloat over that recovery. I was, if I am honest, too exhausted to feel much beyond relief. But I watched the news travel through the castle, exactly the way the laughter once had, starting somewhere near the ward and spreading outward. Until by the following morning, the entire court that had once openly mocked a hedge-witch's daughter for carrying a satchel of dried roots was instead asking, in increasingly hushed and respectful tones, precisely what else that satchel might contain. Rowena was called before Leaf's council within the week, her attempt to seal the ward laid out plainly alongside the recovery of the very niece she claimed to be protecting. She did not deny locking the door. She simply could not adequately explain why protecting frightened children had required barring the one remedy that ultimately saved them, and the council's patience for her explanation ran out considerably faster than her explanations did. I did not attend the council session myself, though Hadrian described it to me afterward with a weary sort of satisfaction. Rowena's careful composure, so effective against a hedge-witch's daughter with no standing to defend herself, proving considerably less effective against a council of elders who had watched her niece nearly die behind a door she herself had ordered barred. Fear, it turned out, made a poor disguise for ambition once the people judging it had children of their own in that same ward. She was stripped of her standing at court and sent from Leif's halls within the month, her presumed place at his side now understood by everyone, including herself, to have never been anything more than a habit no one had thought to question. Leif found me afterward in that same small library, holding my mother's cracked leather satchel, worn considerably softer now from 3 weeks of being carried through halls that had once laughed at it. I have spent 3 weeks trying to prove to you that this court's mockery meant nothing beside my own wolf's judgment, he said. I do not think nearly losing a ward full of children to a locked door was the demonstration I had intended. It worked anyway, I said, though I would ask you not to repeat it. I do not intend to make a habit of it. He looked at the satchel still in my hands, then at me, something in his face finally losing the last of its careful, proud formality. I do not know how to properly thank a woman who saved half my court's children with a bag of dried roots they laughed at 3 weeks earlier. I only know I have never once regretted standing by my wolf's choice, and I intend to keep not regretting it for considerably longer than 3 weeks. You already thanked me, I said, the day you refused to let their laughter change your mind. That is the only thing you ever needed to do. When he kissed me, careful and certain, a man whose pride had been tested publicly and had chosen, every single time, to stand by what he actually believed rather than what was easiest, I felt something in my chest. Some old, quiet bracing I had carried since the day my mother died and left me to prove my own worth alone. Finally settle. He claimed me before the full court a month later, his hand steady on the old iron circlet as he set it on my head himself, in front of every noble who had once laughed at the sight of his wolf choosing a hedge-witch's daughter over their own polished houses. Hadrian stood near the front of that hall, looking, for the first time in 3 weeks, entirely unworried. I watched, from the dais, several of the very nobles who had laughed loudest that first evening now, standing with their heads carefully bowed, and I found I did not need their apology nearly as much as I had once expected I would. The satisfaction, in the end, was not in being owed one. It was simply in no longer needing it at all. 6 months later, I stood in that same library with a letter from a distant village in one hand and my mother's satchel, restocked and considerably better traveled now, in the other. The letter asked, carefully, whether it was true that a hedge-witch's daughter, once laughed out of a summer gathering, was queen of Leif's realm now. I wrote back that it was true, and that the laughter in question had stopped rather abruptly the day it mattered most. Hadrian had stopped bracing every time Rowena's name came up in court gossip, mostly now that she lived considerably farther from the castle than her ambitions had once planned for. The court physician, humbled by his own early dismissal of my knowledge, had asked, somewhat sheepishly, whether I would be willing to formally teach a course of hedgecraft alongside his own trained apprentices, and I had agreed, on the condition that no student of his ever again be permitted to laugh a healer's satchel out of a sick room without first checking what was inside it. And Leaf's court, once so quick to mock what it did not understand, had quietly become known instead for the queen whose knowledge no one dared underestimate twice. Rowena's niece, fully recovered, had taken to visiting the library some afternoons, curious in the particular unguarded way small children are curious about the things adults around them treat as complicated, and had asked me once, with total seriousness, whether the roots in my satchel were magic. I told her they were not magic at all, simply attention, patience, and a willingness to remember what other people had decided was not worth remembering. She had considered this answer with great gravity and declared that she intended to learn every single one of them herself, which I found I did not mind teaching her in the slightest, whatever her aunt's part in all of this had once been. I had also, in those 6 months, quietly begun rebuilding the cottage at the territory's edge, not to live in again, but to keep as a working still room, where the village that had once kept its careful, respectful distance from my mother and me could send for help without needing to travel all the way to the castle gates. It felt, more than any crown ever could, like the truest inheritance my mother had actually left me. Not the cottage itself, but the understanding that being needed and being valued did not have to remain two separate things. I ran my fingers along the worn strap of my mother's satchel and thought about the woman who had stood at the back of a crowded hall 3 weeks before any of it, certain only that attending the gathering at all was an obligation to be endured rather than any kind of beginning. She had no idea, that ordinary summer evening, that the laughter aimed at her was about to become the very thing she outlasted. She only knew she was not going to apologize for the satchel on her shoulder. I like to think she would be glad, now, that she never once considered leaving it at home. Do you think Leaf's wolf knew, somehow, exactly what that satchel would end up meaning to his entire court? Or was it simply fortunate that the woman it chose happened to be carrying the one thing that could save them? Tell me your theory in the comments, and if you want to stay in this library a little longer, comment the satchel and I will know exactly what you are asking for. Thank you for standing at the back of that hall with me. Wherever you are listening from tonight, welcome to Leaf's court. Follow along for the next story from this side of the border. There are more kings in these hills, whose wolves no worth a laughing room cannot yet see, and I intend to tell you every one of their stories.